So we're going to be spending the next hour. I have to tell you that when I worked on this presentation, I had in my head this was 90 minutes. So this will be the fast version. We're gonna go through this because as I was looking through, there's not a lot I really wanted to cut because I took a 2 full day training to put it into an hour and a half, and now we're down to an hour. So we'll see what we get done. Those of you that did not get handouts, I will email them to Amy and Lisa, and we'll see if we can't get them uploaded so that you'll have access to them at a later time. So our objectives today are going to be being able to describe the importance of practice-based coaching. How many are familiar with practice-based coaching or have heard it, PBC? We're going to be referring to it as PBC throughout the presentation, but that stands for practice-based coaching. We're going to be able to describe the importance of that and how it relates to teacher and child outcomes. You're going to be able to describe the 3 key coaching cycle components to practice-based coaching and give an example of that cycle in action, hopefully. And then the part that we're not quite sure we'll get to is you kind of looking at a case study and being able to create some goals using the case study information. So what I did do is I did provide, so some of you have the case study and the information that you'll need. Otherwise, I will get that information and we'll get it uploaded. Okay, so we're going to start with what practice-based coaching is. It's a professional development strategy that uses a cyclical process. It supports teachers' use of effective teaching practices that lead to positive outcomes for children. And one of the most important things that we're going to have a pretty good focus on here is that it's happening in the context of collaborative relationships. So it is focused on the teacher's use of evidence-based practices, and we're looking at children being able to progress with their school readiness skills. So an example there is increasing teacher quality interactions with children to increase children's expressive skills. Okay, that would be a goal that would be supported with evidence-based practices, and it would move the child towards achieving some of those school readiness outcomes versus wanting to, a teacher who maybe wants to set a goal around, I'm going to do more art projects with the kids. So while there's pieces of that, there's ways that can be done to promote school readiness. If it's product-based, then it's probably not. One thing to keep in mind is that if you're dealing with compliance issues, it's not a practice-based coaching, it's not appropriate for practice-based coaching. So an example I would give you is that I went into a classroom, this was several years ago, and we were talking about the universal practices that were in place. We were looking at some self-assessment data, and the teacher said, you know what I really want to work on? I want to work on knowing how many kids are in my class every day. And I went, okay. And she said, I've been written up 2 times for not knowing the child count. So we had to have the conversation around the fact that that's not a practice-based coaching issue, that's a compliance issue. And that I am not going to be able to address that because one of the really important pieces here is that when we're talking about this style of coaching, this is to be non-threatening, non-evaluative. This is supposed to be about the relationship that the coach and the coachee has, and it's supposed to be about moving the needle in teacher practices to improve those outcomes. So when we're talking about something like, I need to know how many children are in my class, there's no way I'm going to be able to coach that, and if something goes wrong, it's going to destroy that collaborative relationship. So compliance issues are really not coaching, practice-based coaching issues, okay? Just putting that out there. So this is the PBC cycle visually. Is anybody familiar with this? Have you seen this? If you go on to eClick, Early Childhood Knowledge and Learning Center, it's a Head Start site, but it's all things early childhood. It's really wonderful. They have a whole section where a lot of these materials are coming from, so you can access a lot of what you will see today on eClick, and at the end I have that website listed for you, so you'll be able to copy it if you don't have a packet, and if you have a packet, it is already in your packet. So we're going to be looking at those 3 components, but as you notice, collaborative relationships are a part of all three of those things. So that first part that envelops all of those components is that collaborative relationship. But we're going to be looking at shared goals and action planning, focused observation, and reflection and feedback. So those are your three main components that we're going to be talking about. So why do we use practice-based coaching? So I think we all know that the research shows that when we just train something, what actually goes into the classroom, so when we talk about theory and discussion, just telling people things, 0% actually shows up in the classroom. When we talk about just a demonstration within a training, then again, we're talking about 0% that's actually making it into teaching practices. When we talk about training and then practice and feedback in training, we get a little bit of something, but we're still only looking at about 5%. But when we combine training with that coaching piece and that support within the classroom and within the context of that collaborative relationship, then we're looking at up to 95%. So that's why we do this. And this is an evidence-based model. So when we talk about those collaborative relationships, again, that's the key. And this is where it gets a little difficult because in programs, most of us do not have external coaches, right? We don't have people that come in from the outside. We don't even necessarily have people on the inside who are just dedicated coaches. How many of you share the hat of supervisor and coach? Yeah. And that's where it can sometimes get tricky. So when we're talking about those shared kinds of roles within this model, this is where it could get a little tricky, but this is where you kind of have to have those two hats to be able to say, you know, in these particular things, in compliance things, we'll be having these types of conversations, supervisory conversations. When we are talking about your teaching practices around positive behavior interventions and supports, we're going to be wearing the coaching hat. And this is where you will have the ability to try new things in a non-threatening way, understanding that you're not going to be evaluated. It gets tricky, but it is doable. But in the perfect world, in this model, you do have somebody that's dedicated to just the coaching piece, not the supervision piece. So again, we talked about those three areas we're going to look at within that collaborative relationship. So when we talk about building that relationship, it is the foundation. So we know that when we talk about pyramid model practices, the whole bottom part of that pyramid is about those relationships. And it's no different when we're talking about coaching and working with adults. So it's really important to be building that foundation with your coachees. It's going to provide the context to what you're about to do so that you can build on teacher strengths. And that's really what this is about. This is about taking what teachers are doing well and making it better. Or if a teacher chooses, if there's something that they're not doing quite so well, that's where you work on those things. So we're talking about strengthening those practices. In this process, the coach and the coachee, you are working together to plan and execute this cycle. So it's not the coach telling the coachee what's going to happen. It's the coachee having the accountability. And when we get to the action planning piece, the coachee is actually the one holding the pen. They're the ones that are actually writing the plan, setting out the timelines, working with the coach side by side. So this really is reciprocal, and it should be very respectful. It is built on the premise of trust, so that idea that it's okay to take risks and try new things, and if it doesn't work, you're not going to get in trouble for it, right? This is not a gotcha. We want it to be safe. We want it to feel good. We want staff and teachers to actually make progress, and so we want it to be supportive and build on trust. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it is not tied to evaluation. So what you're doing there, if there's a supervisor involved, the supervisor, of course, may want to know what the coachee is working on, but it's not evaluative. So it's not a gotcha. It's not a tell me how she did. Oh, she didn't do that correctly. Well, I better go in and take a look at it. This is really about building on practices. So just a quick little, I have these spread throughout. The role of the coach is going to be, of course, to listen, observe, gather evidence, but you notice it's listen, 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 listen all over the place, because that's really the best thing and the most important thing that you're going to do in this role is to listen. The coachee is going to be reflecting and planning and acting on what the plan is and reflecting. And you see, again, it's that same thing, just keeps talking about planning and reflecting, acting, learning. That's their role. So there are 3 types of coaching models within PBC. We're going to focus on the first one, which is the expert one, but there is also models around peer coaching and then self-coaching. Most programs are not designed in a way that it's easy to do the peer coaching or the self-coaching. So we're going to focus on the expert coaching, thinking about somebody coming in from within the program or outside that would be working with teachers. So when we talk about that model, we're talking about the coach and the coachee working together to build that relationship. They decide how the coaching is going to be delivered. So thinking about how the coachee learns best. So just like we individualize and differentiate for our children, we do the same thing for staff. An example of that would be, I was coaching one year and I had one staff person who loved running records. I could hand her a running record of what she had done and she loved it because she could just take that apart and be like, wow. And she would reflect on it and she would say, you know, it's so interesting when I see it in real time and, you know, get a good understanding of what I said and what the other child said, and she loved that. So I got really excited about it and I went to the next classroom and I did the same thing, and within a day my supervisor called me and said, we have to meet. Because she had complained and said, she came in and tore me apart. So what she saw was, you came in and looked at every little detail and she took offense to that. That is not how she learned best. And I learned very quickly what she needed. And so I knew from then on, going into those relationships, I needed to have that conversation around, how do you learn best? How do you want to be coached? How do you want information presented to you? So what works for you? And in doing that, it massively improved my coaching relationship. So that's something that's really important. The coach should be spending time in the early learning setting. So in the classroom, getting to know the teaching style, the children, helping out a little bit, just kind of learning what the routine is so that you become part of that and have an understanding of that when you go in. So you don't get caught up on all those little details when you're in looking at what's happening, and instead you can focus on the practice that you're there to look for. Then maintaining that relationship is really important. So that regular communication. So even if you're not going into the classroom weekly, you're still having some form of communication, whether that's a phone call, email, a FaceTime, some way to communicate how are things going. What do you need? Do you need something from me? How can I best support you? Following through on plans. That's really important. So when you have an action plan and a staff person says, okay, I'm going to work on this particular goal and this is when I'd like you to come see it, and you put it on your calendar, and then 3 days later somebody says, oh, but I'd like to have a meeting with you at that time. It's really important that you are in the classroom at the time that you committed to with that teacher, because they have worked on whatever goal that is, they've held up their end of things, and they're looking for you to come in and give that feedback, and that's really an important part of that trusting relationship. And then again, providing that supportive feedback is important. So this is just an example. You can get this off of eClick, an example of a coaching contract. And this is something that is pretty important because it really outlines the roles and responsibilities of everybody that's involved. So this is one that you could use. You could create your own. I've seen them where it includes the coach, the coachee, and the supervisor so that it clearly spells out the role of what the supervisor will be doing, just to make sure that we're not crossing over and running into any issues where things start to feel evaluative or feel not quite so trusting. But it is kind of important to be able to say, this is what I'm going to do. This is the expectation of what I would like you to bring to this relationship, and for everybody to sign that. And it's always nice to be able to revisit that and be able to look at all that you've accomplished, because it really does spell out what the process will look like. It's very transparent. So this is just one of those funny things about, as a coach, sometimes you can bring cake, bring goodies. That makes people feel good. But then you're also there again for that support, to pull that thorn out of the paw, so to speak. So sometimes things don't go well. Sometimes people really do need more added support, and that's kind of our role, is to do that and give them that support. Okay, so we're going to move into the first component, which is shared goals and action planning. And this is basically what it's going to look like. So we're talking about specifying a specific practice, gathering information about the implementation of those practices through some self-assessments, using the information that you're gathering to identify the coaching priorities, setting SMART goals, and then developing your action plan. So we're going to walk through those pieces. So this is an example of a sample action plan, and in fact, if you got the handouts, this is what you have. This is just one page of it. Again, you can find this and some of these examples up on eClick.
Jen, some folks might not know what eClick is.
Yes. Early Childhood Knowledge and Learning Center. I think you were out when I said, and it'll be at the end. No, it's fine. It's fine. And it'll be on I have it on my last slide too. So, okay. So this is a self-assessment. This is where you kind of want to start. So where you've gone in, you've kind of gotten to know the classroom, the routines a little bit, saw what the teaching style is. Then it's time to sit down and to have the teacher complete a self-assessment. Again, here's an example, but you can create your own. The next slide, actually. Oops, that's the second page to that one. This is one of the pages of one that I created for our program around universal practices and expectations that we have in our program. So you can create your own self-assessment, but the point is for a teacher to be able to look at a set of practices and just kind of rate themselves. Where am I in this? What supports might I need? Where do I want to start? But it's just a springboard for conversation for you to kind of decide where you're going to take this coaching relationship. Just a little cartoon. Can you help me, Mrs. Martin? This wasn't covered in any of my education courses. Okay, so once you have looked at that self-assessment together is where you kind of have to make that decision with the coachee about where the coachee wants to start. And it really should be the coachee's decision. So you might go in and you might see some things and you might see the self-assessment and say, whoa, I really think that, Sally should be working on this particular practice. But she or he might want to work on something else. It really is the coach's choice. Because again, going back to that collaborative relationship, if you are the one who is holding the reins and taking control of that goal planning, that action planning, the teacher isn't going to have that ownership, and it's not going to help that relationship. So you want to go ahead and start where the teacher wants to start. And the nice thing about this process is as you go through several cycles of this and you build that trust, you can get to the point where you can kind of maybe then start to say, hey, I've noticed some of this. What do you think about working on this particular skill? And you can usually end up where you thought you needed to be in the first place. But you might have to go through a couple of cycles of things that maybe you don't think are priority. But it's really about what does the teacher see as the priority for their classroom. And sometimes the other piece of that is what you don't see as a priority. Once you see it in action, you start to realize it is a priority in that classroom, and it is a priority for that teacher. So it's really important to respect the choices that they're making. So once you have determined what your springboard, you've had that springboard conversation and you've decided what you're going to work on, then it's time to start some action planning. And so one of the things that we always talk about, I'm sure everybody's heard of SMART goals? Yes. So when we talk about SMART goals, the overarching goal that the teacher should be setting should be along these lines. So we're talking about very specific, measurable, attainable, right? That's important. Relevant, and then there has to be some form of a timeline that's associated with that. So when we talk about practice-based coaching, we're talking about being able to meet action steps of goals within 1 to 2 weeks. So we're going to look at an action plan and talk a little bit about what I mean by that. So again, here's an example. You can find this on the eClick site. You have a goal that you're setting. So an example might be having supportive, engaging conversations with all of my children every day. So that's a pretty broad goal. And to say that's going to be reached in a week or two is probably not attainable. But that's why we have the action steps. So down here in this part is where you break that goal down. And so sometimes I refer to them as mini goals. So they're you're breaking that goal down into those attainable steps that can be met within a week or two. So maybe it's starting with determining where my children are and their ability to answer open-ended questions. That might be the first step that is part of the action plan. The second step might be I'm going to use open-ended questioning with each of my children over a 3-day period. Third step might be increasing that, and then we're talking about how many turns we're taking in that those conversations to the point that they finally get to being able to have those supportive, engaging conversations with all of their children on a daily basis with fidelity. Okay? So right there you see that there's 4 spots for action steps. There could be more. There could be. So when we say 1 to 2 weeks, we're not really talking about that overarching goal. We're really talking about each of those action steps. So what it might take is more like 6 to 8 to 10 weeks, right? Which that seems a little bit more reasonable when we're talking about such a broad goal like that. So you have your overarching goal, should be, again, SMART. So thinking about all of those pieces, and then breaking that down into the action steps. In this process, the coachee is holding the pen and the coachee is writing the goal. That's really an important piece. They are the ones that are actually writing it. It can absolutely be a collaborative process with the coach and the coachee together, but the coachee really is having control over what that goal is, what those action steps are, and you'll see here, resources needed. That's where together you can outline what supports do you need to get this accomplished. Do you need me to give you something? Do you need me to come model that for you? Would you like some side-by-side coaching? Would you like some literature to read about that? So what supports are needed, and then that by when, that's your timeline. So that's when they're determining, when am I going to have this done? When is it going to be ready for you to come and see? This is another example of an action plan. So again, these can look very different. You can make your own for your own program. There's no wrong format here. This one is actually directly related to PBIS. I believe at one point it did come off the TAXI site, the addressingchallengingbehaviors.org. So this one is actually breaking down the pyramid and talking about those nurturing responsive relationships. So that bottom level, what are the strengths there? What's happening there? What's happening at the high quality environments? What's happening when we're talking about moving into targeted with those social and emotional teachings? and then those intensive supports. And then they break it down here into what are the most difficult parts and what are the 3 things to work on. So that's just a different way to look at that. I don't see this one used as often because it is lacking those other pieces around what are the resources that I need and those timelines. But this is just another example that I wanted to show you. And then one thing that you can do when you're looking at action plans to see if the plan itself is going to meet those SMART goals and is going to be an effective plan to follow. This is also off of eClick, and this is just a checklist to kind of go through and kind of assess the quality of the plan just to make sure. Because sometimes when you're doing those first plans, it's nice to have something to measure it up against and say, did I put this piece in it? Does it contain this? Just to make sure the structure of the plan is going to be effective for you. Okay, are there any questions? We're zipping through this, I know. This, like I said, this is actually a 2-day training. So I'm squeezing that into like 15 minutes. Does anybody have any questions about that action planning? No, I'm sorry. What we're going to try to do is get them uploaded for you, so you'll be able to access them. Any other questions before we move on? Okay, so you've got your action plan, you have a goal, you have action steps, and now it's time to observe. So again, when we talk about that observation piece, we're talking about the coachee making that determination of when that's going to occur. So again, not a gotcha. If they say, I'm going to be ready for you in a week and a half, come Wednesday at 10 o'clock, then that's the time that you come in and observe it. Depending on what your goal is, you might be there for 15 minutes. You might be there for an hour. Might be there for 2 hours. It might be that if you're looking at transitions, that you're going to be looking at some different portions of the day throughout the day, but not necessarily giving feedback on the whole day, just on those pieces that you're supposed to be looking at. Okay, so when we talk about focused observation, we're talking about providing a supportive context for the coachee to try things out. So again, that whole idea of we're in there to support. So whatever they need for that, we're there to see how they're coming along with their goal and give some feedback. It's promoting a culture of accountability, so everybody knows what their roles are. You've spelled that out in the action plan. The coachee knows what they're supposed to do, what they're to have prepared, and you as the coach know exactly what you're coming in to observe. It allows the coach to check in, make sure everything's going okay, how's the plan unfolding. It's your roadmap. That plan is your roadmap. So that's what's telling you what you're going to observe and when. And it's that springboard for reflection and feedback. Again, just talking about reiterating the fact that you're guided by the action plan, and it is very focused on the goals. So sometimes we get into the classroom and we start to see other things, right? Some really great things, and then we also might see some things that might be concerning. But the important thing is that you are focused on what the goal is. So the feedback you're going to provide is on the goal or the action step of the goal. Okay, so all that other stuff, you have to let it go. And again, unless it's of course, if it's compromising child safety, then that's a different topic, but that's for another day. We don't have time for that. Okay, so the coach is observing, recording that information. How you record that can vary. I think I have an example in here. If not, we can talk a little bit more about that. This is where the coach might record what is being seen, what the coachee is saying, how the children are responding. It could be a running record. It could also be that the coachee is just collecting data on something. So if the coachee's goal happens to be, I'm going to use open-ended questioning with my children throughout choice time. then maybe what the coach is doing is using tallies and tallying how many of each type of question they're hearing. So if they're hearing those close-ended questions, they might be tallying those, and then tallying the open-ended, so they can have that conversation around, what those ratios might have looked like. Okay, so here is an example. So I don't know if you can see that really well. It's broken up into 2 columns. So it's what I've observed and then what I want to share. So this form is for the coach. This is not necessarily the form that you hand to a coachee. This is your information because you're going to be writing everything down, but there may be things within that observation that you want to clean up a little bit or you want to use specific language for. So on that right side column is where you can take some notes on what am I going to share, and then how you present that to your coachee, again, really depends on how they want to receive that information. So do they want it in some sort of list form? Do they want it in more of a narrative? How do they want that information? And so you would take that observation and put it into the format that would best work for your person that you're coaching. So the other way that this can be done too, how many of you have a lot of remote sites, are really widespread? Yeah. So we have 25 sites in our program. That's a little overwhelming. So one of the ways that you can also be doing some of this is through the use of video. It does provide an objective way for you to view things. It can be somebody in the classroom that is there that is using the iPad or a phone, if there's no use of a camera of any kind. So it's really them videotaping the lesson for you to see and sending it to you. The really nice thing about this model is that you can see it a lot of times. So when you're watching an observation live, you miss a lot of things, right? Have you all seen the video of the basketball? They're playing basketball, and you're supposed to watch the white shirts and the black shirts and see how many times it gets passed, and then at the end, they say, how many of you saw the gorilla? Have you seen that? How many saw the gorilla? I'm impressed, because I did not see the gorilla. So we miss a lot of things when we're watching things live. So when you see it on video, you can go back and view it several times. The other nice thing about it is you can actually use it with the coachee then. So it's a really great tool to be able to go back and say, hey, I wanted to show you, I don't know if you noticed this, and show that portion of the video. And as you're having your feedback conversation, it's your source of data. It's right there. We, of course, want to use it for a positive. We don't want to say, oh, look what you did. We want to use it to accentuate the growth that they're making on that goal, because that is the whole purpose of this, is to grow in that skill. The other thing that's kind of important to remember is once they send that to you, you need to check with them of what they want you to do with that. So if they say, once you've viewed it and we've used it, I really want you to get rid of it, then we need to honor that and you need to get rid of that. It should never be sent to a supervisor, should never be sent anywhere. It should at minimum stay between the coach and the coachee unless the coachee gives permission for that to be shared. So again, as a coach, you don't have to actually be present in the classroom. I don't recommend this form of coaching to be the only form of coaching you do. You should definitely be getting into the classroom some of the time, but if you're not able to be getting in there weekly or bi-weekly the way that you have planned, this is another way. And some people prefer this way because it feels non-threatening. They don't have somebody in the room watching them. This way they have a little bit more control over it. So again, I mentioned this earlier, that when you are also in the classroom and you are doing your focused observation, and this would be part of when you're doing your action planning, determining what supports you're giving. So you're observing, but then it might also have been the preference of the coachee that you do some modeling. So maybe they'd like you to come in and model a specific practice, or they want you to do some side-by-side, or in the moment they may say, can you help me problem solve this situation? Sometimes it's just a gesture. So I had a teacher that, I'm trying to remember what she kept saying. She kept saying something over and over again. And so she said, I need to stop doing that. Oh, I know what it was. No, thank you. She kept saying, no, thank you. Whenever children, engaged in undesirable behavior, it was no, thank you. And so she wanted to stop doing it. And so what she did was she asked the other, her co-teachers and myself, when I would come in, to give her a signal every time she did it. And so we would just give her a quick, thumb in the air, just to let her know it had happened. And so by doing that, she was able to start to decrease her use of that to where we could get to the point then that she had a replacement phrase that she started to use and was able to phase out the no thank you and add in the other phrase. So sometimes that gestural support is what's needed, what they would like. And then other help, so things like going in and setting up lunch or putting out nap mats, things like that. So that should be infrequent because that's not your role, but sometimes when things are happening in the classroom or when extra help is needed, then that would be something that would help with that collaborative relationship as if you would pitch in and help with some of those things. But again, not on a regular basis. That wouldn't be your role regularly. Or in case of an emergency. Okay, any questions about that focused observation? No? Okay. All right, so we're going to move on to the last piece, which is that reflection and feedback. So this is probably the most important piece because this is where sometimes the collaborative relationship falls apart. It's really easy sometimes to just the way we say things to hurt some of that trust that we've built up. So when we talk about reflection and feedback, we're talking about how the changes in practice are considered, evaluated, and strengthened. So we're really looking at that very specific practice that teacher has set a goal for and what is happening with that practice. Not all the other stuff, but that practice. And then we're looking at what the progress is. So sometimes things will not go well, and that's okay, and you still have those conversations, but you're going to be focusing on the progress and moving forward and how we're going to, sometimes we have to change our action steps or change our goals a little bit. And in this process, new goals will be developed. So when you finish one goal, you move on to something else and you go back to that self-assessment or whatever your point is. Teapots are another, it's not a self-assessment, but it is an assessment tool that you also can use for staff to be able to set goals. So the teapot might come into this as well. So you might be going back and looking at some of those indicators where they were working on those things to see how they're progressing. So this is where the coach is taking the lead in the teacher's reflection, and that's through questioning, taking considerations, talking about how things are going. So there's a couple of different things that we're going to talk about within this. The teachers gain ownership over their own professional development through this process. So when they learn how to reflect, it's really moving them forward in their own professional development, and those are skills that can carry over into other areas. And then through this process, we're looking for that continual improvement. And again, we're looking at moving the needle in teaching practices so that student achievement and outcomes are improved. So it is strength-based, so we're focused on what's going well, what's happening. We certainly aren't going to go in and open with, wow, that was insane. And I have had those days. And it has been really hard to go in and figure out, what am I going to say? I just want to be like, wow, you're wearing clothes today. I don't know what else to say. But you have to find that area again. And when you really are focused on a specific practice, it really helps ground you from going into that wow moment, because everything else might be going nuts, but you get to focus on that one piece. And somewhere in that one piece, you're going to find something very strength-based. It should be conversational and reciprocal. So it's you leading the conversation, but it's having a conversation. So you're going to be doing the prompting, but the teacher's going to be the one that's actually doing that reflective piece. Should be open-ended. We should be providing structured feedback. So going in knowing what you're going to ask. And here's key. If you already know the answer, don't ask the question. So if you had one of those wow days, don't go and say, how do you think the observation went? Because you know the answer to that. Instead, how are things going with your action planning? Okay, so making sure that you know what you're going to ask and how that conversation is going to be structured before you go in. So you want to be well planned for that. It needs to be grounded in that data and observation. So making sure that when you're giving feedback, you have that point of reference. So if you don't feel like you have enough information, don't ask that specific question then. So you need to make sure that you have the information that you need to ask the question to really allow the teacher to be able to reflect on it effectively. Connected to the action plan, of course, it has to be connected to those goals and those action steps. And when you are addressing those areas that maybe didn't go so well, making sure that we're combining those areas that were challenging with the support that they need. So making sure that we're saying, you know, if this didn't go well, here are some supports, or what supports do you need to move forward. So just making sure we're combining those two pieces. So I like this one because it just kind of summarized what I just said. You know, ask how was your day instead of good day. If you ask good day, you usually get or yeah. But this way you get, if you say good day, I suppose, versus how was your day? Well, you know when such and such happened, and you actually get that conversation. How many of you have kids that you have to pick up at school or daycare and you're in the car? I learned really quickly, don't say, did you have a good day? Because all I'm going to get is, nope. How was your day? I get a lot of information, and when I get to the end of it, it really wasn't a nope. So, okay, so some examples. So we have 3 different types of reflection starter questioning type techniques. So we've got objective, interpretive, and comparative. So when we're talking about those objective questions, just open-ended, what happened when? What happened when you tried such and such a thing? You know? Or what have you tried with Sally in the past? You know? And I'm realizing, Sally, that you're over there and I'm using your name, and that's just a name that I use. It's really not directed at you. Okay, interpretive questions. So why do you think such and such happened? Or why do you think it went this way? What do you think would happen if? So really open-ended, no judgment, objective, and it puts it back to the teacher's reflection, right? It's not me. It's not me telling them something. I'm going to get that information from them. And then those comparative questions. So an example, knowing that, what would you do the next time? Or how did that compare to when you did this in the past? Does that make sense? Any questions about those? So an example, you know, instead of how do you think the observation went? Because again, that could be just that you might not want the answer. Try instead, how's it been going with the implementation of your action plan? Because not only are you bringing it back to that plan, but it's going to give you more information about what has been happening since you were last there, right? So that opens it up for them to say, hey, you know what? Last week I tried this, and it did or didn't work, so then I did this. So you're getting more information about what that teacher has done to move their own needle forward within that action plan. And there's that, if you already know the answer, don't ask it. It's not reflective then. So then we also have types of feedback. So when staff are sharing information with us, or if we have observed something and we need to give some feedback, then we've got attributive and non-attributive. So attributive is going to be very opinion-based. I think, kind of thing. It's vague. It's not very specific. It's not very descriptive. Some quick examples. You are so patient. That's a nice thing to say, right? But it doesn't really give them a whole lot of information about what they did or about what that means. That transition took way too long. So again, that's you're giving an opinion. You're not being specific. It's not very descriptive, and it doesn't really move that person forward in any way. So non-attributive is going to be objective. It's going to be more specific, more descriptive. So instead of "you were so patient," you waited 10 seconds for Johnny to get the purple piece in, and when she, oh, look at that, and when she did, she was so proud, you know? And so that's instead of "you were so patient." See how much more information that gives? They know what they did. They see how it moved the needle for that child. And then instead of "that transition took way too long," to say, "it took 3 minutes for the first 4 children to choose their centers." How much more information does that give? So now they know you're not presenting it in a negative way. You're also not saying, "hey, great job," but you're just putting the facts out. You're just being, you know, this is the data that we had. So it took 3 minutes for the first 4 children to choose their centers. And then they can reflect on that. Then we have supportive feedback and constructive feedback. Both of these are still positive. So when we talk about supportive feedback, we're talking about the teacher has completed a corrected practice. So they've done what they said they were going to do, okay? Or we're seeing some movement in the positive direction of where they need to be within that action plan. So an example of supportive feedback would be, "you found just the right moment to offer her that choice." So again, it goes beyond "good job" and is specific and tells that teacher what they did. Constructive feedback is where maybe things aren't going so well, so the goal is going to be to help the teacher to expand or adjust that practice. But it's still not negative feedback. So we're still not putting it in a negative way. So some examples there would be, instead of saying, you know, "this didn't go well," tell me a little bit about what you were thinking when Johnny did not engage in the open-ended questions that you were asking him. So assuming that was the goal. Tell me what you were thinking at that point. You know, what needs to happen next. Another example, something you might try is starting your conversation with Johnny with an easy-to-answer concrete question and then move him into more analytical thinking questions. So giving that suggestion rather than, "wow, that really didn't go well." You know, we're saying, "tell me about that." And maybe you could try, or you might try. Another example would be, "I've seen this done by other teachers," and sharing a practice that you've seen. That's another way to give that constructive feedback. Any questions about all of those questionings, the feedback? Anything like that? It's all making sense? Okay. No, I said I wanted a really good coach. So again, it's about that active listening. And wow, I think I motored through this, and I think we did this. Okay, any questions in general about everything that we just went over?
What's the caseload typically in terms of how many people a coach is coaching?
So the question was, what's the caseload around how many people a coach is typically coaching? Well, so that's going to vary. Amy, remind me, I want to say 15 is what the recommendation somewhere around.
I think it's 14.
14, yeah. So when we look at the people that have developed this and done all the research around this, their suggestion of a caseload is around 14. Again, it's going to vary program to program based on what the role of that coach is. So assuming that somebody that might be coaching in the program is also has other duties, that might not be as easy to do. We have somebody that is assigned just to coaching in our program, and she typically carries a caseload of about 10. Now she's doing coaching in a slightly different way, but she has about 10, but she also has other responsibilities. So she is in charge of induction, onboarding new staff, all of that, orientation, all of those types of things. So she has other duties. When you're a supervisor as well and you're wearing both hats, then that can get a little tricky too. So 14 would be the maximum, I would say. Yes?
Can you speak a little bit to the idea of volunteering to be coached versus being selected as needing coaching?
So the question was, could I speak a little bit to the idea of volunteering to be coached versus being selected to be coached? And that is something that is important here, is that it really needs to be a choice. And that gets difficult because I think we see people that we think could really benefit from coaching, and everybody can benefit from coaching. I think we can agree. Everybody can benefit from coaching. But sometimes we see people that really would benefit but are saying, no, I don't need it, I don't want it. And you have to let that go. You really do. The hope is that as this practice is used and we're using it with more and more staff, the word of mouth about how effective it is and how it is non-threatening, and that staff are really learning a lot, they're building on their skills, they're seeing the outcomes of their children, that will encourage those that maybe do not want to be coached, be more willing and open to that. Did I answer your question? Yeah. Yeah.
You said it's a 2-day training. Is it open to people to get to, or do you have information on if you want to do 2-day training?
Yeah.
We don't have any schedule yet.
Not
but
right
it's
now.
one of our hopes.
Yeah. So it's like I took it here, or not here in Hershey, in Harrisburg. So usually if you check on the Patan website in their training calendar, typically it's offered, I want to say at least once a year. There's usually a training. So yeah, I recommend that.
Jen, they could check the PAQ site too.
Oh,
Sometimes
PAQ, that's
it's
true.
posted on there.
Yeah, PA keys. Any other questions? Oh,
So I have actually been hearing programs talking about having a program goal that they would like the coaches to work on. And I get a little confused with how that looks, if this is supposed to be either A, volunteer, or B, me as the coachee choosing what I want to work on. So,
Yeah.
so I don't know where you fall on that, and I don't know if that, it seems a little confusing to me how we say as a program that this is what we want everybody to work on.
Right.
But if you as the coachee have no interest in working on that, how do you incorporate that program goal? Does that make sense?
yeah. So the question is around, sometimes there's a program goal that administration is saying, we want everybody coached on this particular program goal. My answer to that is that's not a practice-based coaching goal then. So that's not the process that you would use there. That would be a coaching goal, but that's a different type of coaching. So that's, that wouldn't be, because it's not choice, it's not coachee driven. It's probably not non-evaluative, I'm gonna guess. So that would not be the model that you would use for that particular incidence. Yeah.
We use our needs assessment to establish those, and then that's our professional training calendar for the year for sort of the large group versus it being under a coaching model. And we have instructional coaches, I guess, that touch base in different ways. They're doing class assessments and things of that nature, but they're not actually the ones who are in the coachee-coach relationship.
Okay.
A little bit different of a model.
Yeah, slightly different. Yeah. Any other questions, thoughts? Okay, so I think, yes, we're 5 minutes. So what you have, some of you have, I'm sorry, I know there wasn't enough handouts, is actually a case study. So on one side, you would have a packet, and then you would have a paper. On one side is like a case study example, and then the other side is actually a blank action plan. And then the packet is a self-assessment. So what we were going to do, if this was an hour and a half, and it's not, so what we were going to do is kind of work in groups and go through and use the case study and the self-assessment to write an action goal. So you can do that on your own. I actually recommend that if this is a direction that you are already going in or would like to go in, this is a really good exercise. So when I talked about that 2-day training, these are the types of things that you do as part of that training, is go through the whole process using case studies. So I recommend that you kind of look at it, look at the self-assessment, maybe just think about, you know, if you were working with somebody, what would that action goal look like? If you do the 2-day training, you actually practice the feedback as well. So it's pretty good training. I would highly recommend that. So you can take these with you, and like I said, I'll get the information to Lisa and Amy to upload. Oh wait, I got to turn off.
Okay, thank you, Jen. If we can give her a round of applause, please.